Hi everybody, I'm Andrea Kaut. This is session 14 in chapter 47, Federal Involvement in Gifted and Talented Education by Patricia O'Connell. Here is a timeline of all the events discussed in the chapter to give you a better understanding of how everything occurred. Okay. A quick reminder, education was not mentioned in the Constitution and therefore is a responsibility of the states under the 10th Amendment. However, the federal government has become increasingly involved in education over the past decades. The first event O'Connell discusses is the launch of Sputnik, a Soviet satellite. It was a huge moment in the race to space in the Cold War. Many Americans were very concerned that the Soviet Union was able to launch a satellite, and fear grew that American schools were not doing enough to produce smart students who could be the Soviet Union. This fear led to the National Defense of Education Act in 1958. This was the first major piece of federal legislation regarding education. At this time, the public was most concerned about students who would be able to help beat the Soviets, not all students. Title V provided funds for testing and identifying able students, providing guidance and counseling for these able students so that they could develop their gifts and talents and go to college, especially those gifted in math and science. In the 60s and 70s, this focus on able students died down after the U.S. space program became more successful. At that time, the public became more concerned with the rights of special children and helping disadvantaged students to do well. The Great Society legislation was passed by Lyndon B. Johnson as part of his war on poverty. This included the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and Title I legislation, which pushed to support the rights of various groups of students. Originally, this included gifted and talented students, but they were actually written out. A few years later, Congress requested a study on the education of gifted and talented students in the U.S. This resulted in the Marland Report of 1972, which reported that services for gifted students were practically non-existent and that undeveloped talent had a high individual and social cost. The report argued that testing was expensive and that educators were apathetic or hostile towards gifted students, and that this resulted in psychological damage. This report led Congress to create the Office of Gifted and Talented within the U.S. Office of Education. They provided $2.5 million of funding, equal to about $14.5 million today, for research and development of gifted education. At the time, the public was concerned about helping all students, but this was passed with the argument that this was helping the well-being of gifted students. This funding only lasted until 1981, and then it was given to the states to spend at their own discretion. Gifted education was given funding once again in 1988 when Congress funded the Jacob K. Javits Gifted and Talented Students Education Act, a program with the same name. This resulted in part from the publication of A Nation at Risk, which urged that schools needed to be reformed and improved. In the late 80s, national goals were set that expected all students to be achieving at higher levels. This included gifted students. This resulted in Goals 2000, passed in 1994, which set forth educational goals to be reached by the year 2000. At the same time, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was reauthorized as the Improving America Schools Act. This act expected acceleration, enrichment, and other strategies usually used for gifted students to be used on all students. All students were expected to meet the same standards, complete complex curriculum, use problem solving, learn about the arts, and experience enrichment and acceleration, and to be assessed the same, regardless of their individual needs. At the same time, a report called National Excellence, a case for developing America's talents, came out and blamed America for, quote, squandering one of its most precious resources, the gifts, talents, and high interests of many of its students. The report made recommendations for gifted education and argued that concerns about gifted and talented students fit within the concerns of the whole nation. The article ends by discussing No Child Left Behind, which was passed in 2001. No Child Left Behind is known for its focus on accountability, choice, flexibility, and reading. O'Connell explained that No Child Left Behind continues the Javits program and research on gifted and talented education. Now, this article was published in 2003, so a lot of things have happened since then, including the publication of A Nation Deceived, which described research-backed strategies for accelerating and enriching gifted and talented students. Since then, we have also seen the publication of National Standards for Gifted of Education and an update of those standards a few years ago. Of course, the state of gifted education is constantly changing, and we'll have to see where it goes next. I have 2 questions that I want everyone to focus on in their discussion posts. Since this article was published when No Child Left Behind was still pretty new, and O'Connell seems pretty excited about No Child Left Behind, I want to hear from your experiences. Was No Child Left Behind good or bad for students with gifts and talents? Also, what trends do you notice in the history of gifted education as covered by this chapter? What sort of causes and effects do you see happening between events? Thanks, everyone!